Hi there, welcome to Silent Film and American Culture. And today we're going to be talking about women in the silent film industry, especially behind the camera. So, from the early silent era until the coming of sound in the late 1920s, women played a significant and until recently overlooked role in the business of movie making in the United States, not just in front of the camera as actors, but more importantly, behind the camera in a variety of roles. Before we look specifically, though, at the silent film industry, I wanted to give you guys a little bit about the historical context in which this situation is happening, in which the rise of the silent film industry is happening in regards to women's roles and conceptions of gender. So, one important context is the idea of the progressive era. So many far-reaching economic and social changes are transforming American society in the late 19th and early 20th century, including innovations in science and technology, economic productivity, mass communication, mass entertainment, and health and living standards. So progressivism is a label at this time that applied to a wide range of economic, political, social, and moral reform movements from this time period. Progressive reformers sought to eliminate corruption in government, regulate business practices, address health hazards, and improve working conditions. So policies that were part of the progressive movement included efforts to outlaw the sale of alcohol, regulate child labor and sweatshops, manage natural resources, ensure pure and wholesome food products, and Americanize immigrants, which we'll actually see in one of the films today. So mostly drawing on support from the urban, college-educated middle classes, progressives also fought to give the public more direct control over government through direct primaries to nominate candidates for public office, direct election of senators, and women's suffrage, most importantly, culminating in the 19th Amendment in 1920. So important thing for us to remember is we really can't put contemporary political labels directly onto the progressive movement, a century or more ago. I mean, it might be easy to just sort of label this as left or right, conservative or liberal, but there's a lot of things about the conservative movement that sort of encompass different parts of what we would see today as the political spectrum. For example, a lot of people, and especially women, who were actively involved in women's suffrage were also very much in favor of the prohibition of alcohol. And a lot of that had to do with sort of issues of domestic violence that were connected to alcoholism. Also, too, we may think of some progressive policies as, regulating child labor in sweatshops, or, ensuring sort of impurities in food were removed and ensuring sort of food packaging and handling were safe. We may see that as sort of more progressive. But there's also a lot of paternalism in some of these policies. There's also a lot of sort of the middle class saying we need to help immigrants and the poor who really don't know better. So, think about that when we're talking about some of the context of the progressive era that appears in the films that we're watching today by women filmmakers, and specifically why women are interested in the particular issues that they are as seen through these films. So another part of the historical context is women's role in society. This is a time period that also witnessed the movement of women into the workforce and in public life in America. So the standard kind of role previously in American society as women as mother and as becoming more complex, with working outside of the home increasingly part of the conception of womanhood in the first couple decades of the 20th century. Now, of course, some of the early suffrage claims for women to be able to get the right to vote are based on this idea of the mother, right? We need this mothering, nurturing influence in politics. But that's actually kind of changing. And as more women are sort of entering the workforce, and as sort of gender conceptions of gender, or traditional conceptions of gender, are starting to shift, you get this more complex idea of what women, the idea of womanhood. Now, of course, this is also very classed, right? A lot of women have always worked outside of the home, especially working class women, especially women of color who are often in lower classes. But this is sort of the kind of middle class conception of womanhood. A sexual revolution was already starting to take place as access to birth control expanded, and kind of traditional moral restrictions are loosening. We're definitely going to see this later in the semester when we talk about flapper movies. So as women achieved greater public visibility and political rights, old cultural images and stereotypes about women and gender relations, however, do not quickly fall away. So we'll kind of see sort of older ideas and newer ideas about women and gender kind of negotiating the same space in the films for this week, as well as films throughout the rest of the semester. So you have this idea of the new woman who is independent, educated, physically active, and working outside of the home. But you also have some of these more Victorian notions still there in the cultural milieu. So the silent film era, which is roughly kind of the first 3 decades of the 20th century, overlaps quite significantly with this transition in American culture around the idea of gender and gender roles. So how do movies created by women reflect and manage these changes? So that's something that I want to talk about when we look at the films for today, for this week. So let's specifically talk about women behind the camera in the silent film era. So what kind of jobs would you sort of expect women to work in the movie industry in those early decades? You know, if you know nothing about the silent film era and you think of women, right, we think of actresses, maybe costume designers, secretaries at the studio, assistants. And then maybe our first conception would be women would be less likely to be directors, screenwriters, script supervisors, camera operators, producers, theater owners, managers. So the assumption would be, I think, kind of going to this without the historical knowledge, that women would doing less prestigious, lower paid jobs, like in other industries. You know, as women are increasingly entering kind of the modern workforce in larger numbers, they're usually going into lower paid jobs, right? Secretarial work, or, you know, jobs that are feminized and seen as caregiving jobs, right? Like nursing. So this is kind of true in the early film industry, but not as much as was true in other industries, and not as much early on as we would expect looking back today. Businesswoman magazine, there was a Businesswoman magazine in the 1920s, in 1923 listed 29 different jobs that women held in the film industry in the US, in addition to actress, including typist, stenographer, secretary to the stars, executive secretary, telephone operator, hairdresser, seamstress, costume designer, milliner, reader, script girl. Okay, so those are all kind of expected, right? Especially script girl. Like, I wonder what a script boy was. But the list goes on, and maybe as the list goes on, it's our expectations are being challenged. Scenarist, cutter, film retoucher, film splicer, laboratory worker, set designer, set dresser, librarian, artist, title writer, publicity writer, plasterer molder, casting director, musician, film editor, department manager, director, and producer. So one of what's really interesting, especially about the early silent era, is that women are prominent and they have a larger place in the film industry during the silent era, especially the early silent era, than they would for years to come in Hollywood. What's really interesting, though, in the silent era, women excelled most at the writing aspect of filmmaking: scenario writer, script writer, script supervisor, script cleaner. Copyright records from the Library of Congress show that almost half of all films made in the US between 1912 and 1929 were written by women. I mean, we're nowhere near that today in the 21st century. That's incredible. So especially in the early silent era, kind of, the first 2 decades of the 20th century, many of the jobs in filmmaking were not as clearly defined as people would do multiple jobs. There's also a lot of collaborating, and actors and directors are moving back and forth from behind to in front of the camera. And some of the women that we'll look at for class today are exactly doing that. They kind of maybe start out as an actress, they go behind the camera. So a lot of work people did things on scripts and directing, especially by women, could go uncredited, but they're there and they're doing this work. We can also think of women doing film adjacent jobs, film reviews, right? That's another aspect of writing. Gossip columnists, there were some really important ones, especially in the 20s. And later, moral crusaders for film censorship. I mean, that may be not one that we look at positively today, but it's still, activists in the film industry. Another thing that's really important in the silent era is networks of women in the silent era helping each other. And as Frances Marion, sort of a noted woman behind the camera in the film industry, noted at the end of her life, she said, quote, "I have found that it always has been one of my own sex who has given me a helping hand when I needed it." And one of the things we'll actually be talking about in a later class when we talk about sort of queer Hollywood in the silent era is queer women who at the time would have identified as lesbian or bisexual, had some pretty significant networks in Hollywood. They were often called the sewing circle, to sort of help along each other. So, there's that aspect of sort of women helping women in the early industry as well. So why exactly did women participate so heavily in early filmmaking, especially in kind of the more what today we would see as prestigious jobs, director, scriptwriter, that sort of thing? And why were women even seen as desirable as writers and directors in this industry? You would think there would be a lot of prejudice about them, against them, and that comes later. That's because in the early years of film, movies and filmmaking were not taken as seriously as other more established businesses, especially creative businesses. So New York and New Jersey, specifically Fort Lee, New Jersey, which was kind of the Hollywood before Hollywood, were the hub of activity in the early years of the motion picture industry. But, by kind of the 19-teens, the locus of filmmaking was moving west to Hollywood. So what did this mean for women? Kind of when filmmaking was in New York and New Jersey in the early years in Hollywood, doors were pretty wide open to women who were unwelcome in other professions. I mean, maybe it was easier to be a script writer in something like silent film that wasn't seen as important professionally than being taken seriously as a novel writer or a journalist. Movies were kind of made really sort of quickly and haphazardly sometimes early on. The idea, you'd get an idea one week, you'd film the next, and it'd be in theaters within a month. So there's no kind of clear professional paths to follow. So there's really kind of no rules for women to break. They're sort of helping to create the system and the rules. So as the demand for movies skyrocketed, Fort Lee and then later Hollywood really becomes this industry where a lot of women are working. Women were the majority of the film audience too in the silent era. Some estimates indicate even 70 to 80% of the audience in those first couple decades of film were women. So producers also wanted to cater to a female audience with what they perceived as writers and other contributors to movies who could create films that were sold to this audience. But of course, we're pretty much talking about specifically a white female middle class audience. We'll talk about a few other people like Marion Wong who were not, but mostly this is kind of a white middle class audience. So we will be focusing here in class on women directors and writers whose credits are documented and known. But remember the dozens, if not hundreds, of people behind the camera in the silent era, many of whom are women, making this industry into a global entertainment power whose names probably are lost to us. So today we'll be looking at Alice Guy Blaché, Lois Weber, Mabel Normand, and Cleo Madison. In a later class, we'll be looking at Frances Marion. We'll also be looking at Alla Nazimova. You also can't, as I said, forget women of color who were pioneers. Unfortunately, much of their work is lost. However, you did have a required video this week about the work of Marion Wong and how her work has sort of been rediscovered and restored. So why exactly did this situation end? Why did as one female filmmaker from the silent era called it, why did this manless Eden sort of come to an end? Why did the participation of women in Hollywood behind the camera decline significantly? And that significant decline really happens in sort of the mature silent era. This is the 1920s, when you still have silent film. You don't have sound yet, but sort of the Hollywood style is set. The studio system is set. The star system is set. You know, the standard Hollywood narrative is set. And then definitely by the sound era, you know, this pronounced participation of women is gone. There's actually only one working female director at a major Hollywood studio from the late 20s to the early 1940s, and that's Dorothy Arzner, who was a queer woman, but one woman. So you go from kind of this system of women being in front, you know, behind the camera as directors, but, you know, as script writers and all of these other positions, to one director in kind of the golden age of Hollywood during the sound era, and a few writers, but not that many. So filmmaking in general, but specifically positions like scriptwriter, like director, started to become more prestigious and sought after as the film industry matures. You also had the professionalization and unionization of many of these jobs, such as screenwriter and director. And so women are being shut out the more they become professionalized and unionized. And you have something that we'll talk about in a later class, the consolidation of the studio system. So in the early to mid-silent era, what was once hundreds of studios making content, many very, very small, you know, and that made it easy for women to sort of enter this industry. Making films in the silent era consolidated into basically a handful of major studios by the end of the 1920s. So it's much easier for women to work in this industry when it's a bunch of sort of small little kind of startups, as opposed to, you know, 5 or 6 large corporations. We'll be talking about a lot more of these issues in class, but I would highly recommend to check out the excellent and comprehensive website for the Women Film Pioneers Project, which is hosted by Columbia University's Film and Media Studies Department, for tons of information on women in the silent and early talkie film industry in general, and also a lot of information on specific women in the film industry. I'll post the link on Google Classroom. So looking forward to watching silent films by women and talking about a lot of these issues in class.